Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. UPSC has announced the results for Prelims 2020 yesterday. So congratulations to all those aspirants who cleared the first round. If you have cleared, do let us know in the comment section below along with your expected scores. But those who didn't make it this time, please don't feel dejected because this is not the end of the road. Remember that the UPSC Civil Services examination not only tests your knowledge and aptitude, but it also tests your perseverance. And in this examination, success will come to those who persevere and work hard. So think of your failure as a part of the learning curve and use this opportunity to introspect so that you can identify your mistakes and you can identify where you went wrong. Use this opportunity to identify your weak areas and ask yourself whether you studied enough and whether you took up enough practice tests. Use this learning to make a course correction in your preparation and you will come back stronger in the next attempt. And those who cleared, don't get too complacent, don't get carried away by the results because this is just step one of a long process. The battle for mains is going to be much harder because mains is the true test of your efforts and skills. So put your head down and stay focused on your preparation. With this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. The FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force, has decided to retain Pakistan on its grey list until Feb 2021. So before we look at this article, first let's talk about the FATF in detail. See, the FATF is an intergovernmental organization that was set up in 1989 by the G7. When it was set up, its initial objective was to come out with policies that could help the global community to fight against money laundering. Later in 2001, that is after the 9/11 attacks, the mandate of FATF was expanded to include terrorist financing as well. So today, the FATF has two primary objectives. One, to combat money laundering and to counter terror financing. The Secretariat of FATF is located at the headquarters of OECD in Paris, and it is responsible for laying down the standards for combating money laundering and terror financing. So the FATF is essentially a policy making body that comes out with the basic standards, which has to be implemented by the member states and the countries around the world by coming up with their own suitable national legislations and regulatory reforms. The FATF not only comes out with these standards and guidelines, but it also works with national governments in order to generate the necessary political will to pass these domestic laws and reforms. So essentially, the FATF also plays a role in ensuring effective enforcement of these policies. For example, India has introduced the Prevention of Money Laundering Act in order to fulfill its obligations to the FATF, and it frequently amends the PMLA as well in order to stay in tune with the changing standards of FATF. Then to combat terror financing as prescribed by the FATF, India has even amended the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So through such domestic laws, India has ensured that its legal framework is in tune with the standards prescribed by the FATF. And there are 9 FATF-style regional bodies around the world in order to disseminate these international standards and ensure their effective implementation. So to check whether countries around the world are following these standards of the FATF, it has also put in place a monitoring mechanism. The FATF periodically conducts a review and mutual evaluation of the member countries, and those countries which deliberately fail to match up to FATF standards, and those countries that are not showing the necessary will to combat money laundering and terror financing, they can be placed on the black list and the grey list of FATF. Formally, the black list of FATF is referred to as call for action, and the grey list is formally referred to as other monitored jurisdictions. And when a country is placed on the grey list or the black list of the FATF, then there are going to be severe consequences. See, the FATF places a country on its grey list if it has turned into a safe haven for terror funding and money laundering. But however, a country getting grey listed is not as severe as being blacklisted. Because when a country is placed on the grey list of FATF, it is more of a warning to the country to improve its enforcement of anti-money laundering and anti-terror financing measures. After a country is placed on the grey list, the FATF prescribes an action plan with a set of action points which have to be implemented by that country within a prescribed deadline. If the grey listed country manages to achieve these targets within the given deadline, then it will be removed out of the grey list and no further action would be taken against that country. But however, if a country repeatedly fails to implement these given action points, then that country faces the risk of being put on the blacklist of FATF. And once a country is blacklisted, there are going to be severe economic consequences. See, currently, Iran and North Korea have been placed on the blacklist of FATF. Once placed on the blacklist, it is going to severely affect the import and exports of that country. It will also affect the inflow of remittances into the country, and it will limit the access of that country to international funding. Because once a country is placed on the blacklist of FATF, global financial institutions such as World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, etc., they become very cautious when it comes to lending to that country. These international institutions will take up enhanced measures to check all the transactions, and eventually it might even lead to a funding cut from these organizations. So this in turn will affect the sovereign credit rating of that country, because credit rating agencies such as Moody's, Standard & Poor and Fitch, they will definitely take corrective action and they are going to downgrade the sovereign credit rating of that country. And as the credit ratings are downgraded, the inflow of capital into that country would also be adversely affected. So essentially, getting blacklisted by the FATF could stifle the economy of that country. And Pakistan has continued to remain on the grey list of FATF since 2018, and it faces the prospect of being blacklisted. See, a couple of years ago, the FATF put Pakistan on its grey list because of its failure to act against money laundering and terror financing. Subsequently, Pakistan was prescribed an action plan under which it was supposed to implement 27 specific measures within a deadline that was prescribed by the FATF. But Pakistan has repeatedly missed these deadlines, and each and every time FATF has given an extension to Pakistan, and as of now it has implemented 21 out of these 27 prescribed measures. So even after 2 years, Pakistan still falls short of implementing these measures, and at the latest summit of the FATF, it has decided to retain Pakistan on its grey list until February 2021, and it expects Pakistan to implement the remaining measures within this deadline. During the latest summit, Pakistan managed to receive the support of Turkey, and it insisted that the FATF members should take into account the good work that Pakistan has done over the last 2 years and provide another opportunity with a new deadline so that Pakistan can implement the remaining action points. But interestingly, during the latest summit, even close allies of Pakistan such as China, Malaysia and Saudi Arabia have not given support, and this points to the extent of Pakistan's failure in implementing the FATF standards. At the FATF summit, it has been pointed out that Pakistan has repeatedly failed to act against a number of charitable organizations and so-called non-profit organizations that have clearly established links with various terror groups that have been banned by the UN Security Council. The FATF has also taken note of the delays in prosecution on Pakistan's part when it comes to prosecuting the top leaders of terror organizations such as the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. The top leadership of Lashkar, such as Hafiz Saeed and Zakir Rahman Lakwi, have hardly faced any action from the Pakistani authorities. Then Masood Azhar, who heads Jaish-e-Mohammed, has again been let off by the Pakistani state, and the repeated delays in prosecuting them has been highlighted by the FATF. After years of pressure from the FATF, Pakistan recently took some action against Hafiz Saeed, and he currently remains in jail on charges of terror financing. But however, other terrorists who have been listed as global terrorists by the UN Security Council, they either remain untraceable in Pakistan or they continue to roam around freely in Pakistan, thereby highlighting Pakistan's lack of interest in targeting these individuals. The FATF has also noted that there have been very few convictions when it comes to terror cases involving terrorists of Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network. It's a well-known fact that Pakistan's ISI has close connections with Afghanistan-based terror outfits such as the Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network, and it uses them to wage its proxy war against countries such as India. Apart from this, Pakistan has also shown non-compliance when it comes to acting against organized crime in the region. See, the AFPAK region, which is also referred to as the Golden Crescent region, has emerged as a global hub for several organized criminal activities, including the cultivation and smuggling of narcotics, the smuggling of mining products and precious metals and stones, and all such illicit criminal activities. They generate a lot of illegal wealth which has to be laundered, and such proceeds of money laundering eventually reaches terror groups as well. And that's the reason why it is said that there is a direct connection between organized crime and terror financing. Take for example the connections between the narcotics and smuggling cartel of Dawood Ibrahim and its connections with Pakistani state agencies such as the ISI, and how this organized criminal group has continued to fund a number of terror outfits in the region which primarily target India. So by taking all these factors into account, the FATF has served one more warning to Pakistan, and it has directed Pakistan to implement the remaining 6 action points by February 2021, and until then, Pakistan shall continue to remain on its grey list. India on its part has capitalized on this opportunity to target Pakistan through its coercive diplomacy. India, which has been at the receiving end of state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan, has been proactively making use of such international platforms to target Pakistan diplomatically and economically. India, along with the United States, have been at the forefront of collecting evidence against Pakistan's inaction when it comes to tackling money laundering and terror financing. And this evidence that has been provided by India, along with few other like-minded countries, has played a key role in convincing the FATF to act against Pakistan. Now let's take up the next article. Nepal's Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli has used the old map of Nepal while sending out Dasara greetings, and this possibly hints at a softer stand being taken by Nepal with regard to its border dispute with India. See, earlier in the month of May and June, Nepal had escalated the minor Kalapani dispute into a major border dispute with India. By making fresh claims over the disputed Kalapani region, the KP Oli government in Nepal had triggered tensions with India, and we had covered this development in detail throughout the month of May and June multiple times. See, the Kalapani dispute along with the Sustar dispute were minor border disputes between India and Nepal that trace back their origin to the Treaty of Sugauli signed in 1816. But the KP Oli government chose to escalate this minor border dispute into a major border dispute with India, and this has completely derailed Nepal's relations with India over the last few months. As a follow-up to these controversial claims, Nepal's parliament also amended Nepal's constitution in order to approve a new political map of Nepal, in which Nepal claimed the entire triangular area located between Kalapani, Lipu Lake Pass and Limpiadura, which are essentially a part of the Pithoragarh district in the border state of Uttarakhand. So the publication of this new political map by Nepal through a constitutional amendment had further triggered tensions with India. And if you look at this map, this entire triangular area was claimed by Nepal by the publication of this new map. But in what appears to be a change in policy on the part of the Nepali government, Nepal's Prime Minister KP Oli has used the old map of Nepal, which was acceptable to India, to send out Dasara greetings. And this could possibly hint at a softer stand being taken by the KP Oli government with regard to its border dispute with India. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which evaluates the new farm laws that have been passed by the centre and the legislative and legal measures that state governments are taking in order to override these central laws. Just a few days ago, on the 17th of October, while we were discussing about MSP, we had a detailed discussion on the 3 new farm laws that have been introduced by the centre in order to liberalize agriculture marketing. Through these laws, the centre is looking to allow the farmers to sell their produce outside of APMC mandis, which would essentially allow the farmers to bypass the middlemen and directly sell their produce to private players and corporate companies. The centre hopes that this liberalization reform will increase farmers' income and help transform the agriculture marketing ecosystem by reforming the APMC yards. But however, these new farm laws have triggered a major controversy, and a number of state governments, along with farmers and farmer organizations from around the country, are opposing it. This has brought thousands of farmers to the streets, and they are demanding the centre to roll back these reforms. Because the fear of the farmers and few state governments is that if farmers are allowed to sell outside APMC yards, then they might be exploited by the private players and the corporate companies. because these laws do not make any mention of minimum support price and MSP does not enjoy any legal backing. So when farmers are directly exposed to the market, especially to big corporates, then they can misuse their large bargaining power in order to force the farmers to sell their produce at a price much lower than the MSP. The state governments and the farmer organizations believe that the corporate players could exploit their advantage and their bargaining power to harass and force number of farmers to sign contracts through which they can procure the produce at very cheap prices and maybe even at prices lower than the MSP announced by the government. So this has led to fears that the new farm laws will compromise the interests of small and marginal farmers because they have no bargaining power when it comes to negotiating with private players and corporate companies. In fact, the Punjab state government, which has been at the forefront of this opposition, has referred to an agricultural census of 2015-16, which shows that nearly 86.2% of the farmers in Punjab own less than 5 acres of land and a majority of them own less than 2 acres of land. So these small and marginal farmers will have limited or no access to multiple markets, and this disadvantage would force them to sell their produce to a few select private players who can exploit their condition. But the centre has defended these laws by stating that the real intention is to liberalize agriculture marketing and enable small marginal farmers to increase their income by selling their produce directly to the companies instead of selling it through the middlemen. But this opposition by the state governments and farmer organizations has turned the issue into a major centre-state dispute, and several states are exploring both the legislative option and the legal route to challenge these laws and even to override these laws passed by the centre. See, right now, the parliament has passed these laws by making use of its powers under the concurrent list. Because according to the centre, the subject of trade and commerce and also the subject of production, supply and distribution of foodstuff falls under the concurrent list as per the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, and hence legislative powers over these subjects are jointly shared between the parliament and the state legislatures. But however, state governments such as the Punjab government have argued that this subject should actually fall under agriculture and agriculture marketing, which is essentially a part of the state list under the 7th schedule. Based on this argument, the Punjab government has already introduced a state law in order to counter these central laws, and as per this law, any buying of agricultural produce below MSP rates and any harassing or exploitation of farmers will be treated as a punishable offence, which includes the possibility of a jail term as well. So this essentially brings the central law in direct conflict with the laws being passed by the state governments, and this has to pass through the test of constitutionality and legality. The Constitution says that whenever there is a conflict between a state law and a central law, it is the central law which will prevail. The Constitution also states that if a state law has to prevail over a central law, then it will require a special assent from the President after such a law is reserved by the state governor for the consideration of the President. Then on the other hand, the legal and constitutional validity of the central laws should also be verified, because the centre has passed these laws by stretching the definition of trade and commerce and by stretching the definition of production, supply and distribution of foodstuff to include agriculture as well. And if this is held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, then the state laws will prevail as the subject of agriculture clearly falls under the state list. As of now, different states are taking different routes, and states like Punjab and Rajasthan are taking the legislative route to come out with their own state laws to directly counter the central laws and override those provisions. Other states such as Chhattisgarh, they are looking to take up the legal route through which they are likely to take the matter to the Supreme Court in order to challenge the constitutional and legal validity of the central laws passed by the Parliament. But either ways, this issue highlights a deep-rooted problem when it comes to the manner in which the Government of India has been passing laws and the manner in which it has been dealing with the state governments. Even if the central laws have been introduced with the right intention of reforming the agriculture sector, the centralized approach of the Government of India and its failure to engage in wide consultation and informed debate goes against the very tenets of a parliamentary democracy, especially when such critical policies are bound to affect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people in the country. So the editorial argues that when such critical laws are being passed, the centre has to ensure that there is widespread consultation with all the stakeholders, including the state governments and the industry representatives. And it should also ensure that there is informed debate within the parliament, because only then consensus can be built on such divisive issues, and any centralized approach by the Government of India is bound to turn into such controversies. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Parliamentary privilege refers to rights and immunities enjoyed by Parliament as an institution and by MPs in their individual capacity. The Constitution of India does not specify any of the privileges and allows the Parliament to define them by passing a suitable law. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect. Because in the Indian Constitution, some of the parliamentary privileges enjoyed by the Parliament as an institution and by MPs in their individual capacity have been defined under Article 105, whereas the Constitution allows the Parliament to define the other privileges, rights and powers of the Parliament and the MPs by passing a suitable law. So the correct answer would be option A, 1 only. See, as mentioned in the first statement, parliamentary privilege refers to the rights and immunities enjoyed by the Parliament and by the MPs. Under Article 105 of the Indian Constitution, some of these parliamentary privileges have been defined. This includes freedom of speech in Parliament, the immunity to a member from any proceedings in any court with regard to the vote cast by the member in the Parliament, etc. But in other respects, the powers, privileges and immunities can be defined by the Parliament by passing a suitable law. When these parliamentary privileges are breached by any individual or by any institution, then suitable action can be taken by the respective House of the Parliament. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 1, a joint committee of the Parliament which was examining the draft data protection bill is planning to take action against Amazon for breach of parliamentary privilege. This joint parliamentary committee had invited technology firms such as Facebook, Amazon, Google, Twitter, etc. to provide their views on the question of privacy and data security while it was examining the data protection bill that has been tabled by the government in the Parliament. But Amazon failed to respond and it failed to send its representative to meet with the joint parliamentary committee, and the joint parliamentary committee is looking to treat this as a breach of parliamentary privilege and take suitable action against Amazon. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are incorrect? The Integrity Pact is a powerful tool developed by Transparency International to help governments, businesses and civil society to fight corruption in public contracting. For public procurement in India, the Integrity Pact is enforced by the Lokpal. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect because the Integrity Pact, which was developed by Transparency International, is enforced in India by the CVC or the Central Vigilance Commission and not by the Lokpal. So since the second statement is incorrect, the correct answer would be option B, 2 only, because the question is asking you to identify the incorrect statement. See, Integrity Pact is a powerful tool developed by Transparency International, which is a global organization to help governments, businesses and civil society to fight corruption in public contracting. Under this pact, an agreement is signed between the government authorities and all the bidders who are participating in a public contract. This agreement lays down the rights and obligations of both the parties, that is the procuring authority and as well as the bidders. It obligates the bidders and the government authorities to stay away from corruption and from accepting or demanding bribes. And it also prohibits the bidders from colluding with each other in order to cut down competition. Under this model, a panel of independent external monitors are set up for each government organization, and the task of this independent committee is to carry out a thorough review of public procurement independently and objectively and ensure that both the parties have complied with their obligations under the Integrity Pact. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 9, the Central Vigilance Commission has made amendments to the standard operating procedure on the adoption of Integrity Pact in government organizations. As per the amendment, the panel of independent external monitors should include officials from government organizations and public sector units who have retired at the rank of secretaries. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The International Labour Organization is a UN agency and is the first and oldest specialized agency of the UN. The governing body of the ILO decides on matters of agenda and budget and as well as elects the Director General. India holds a permanent seat in the governing body as one of the 10 states of chief industrial importance. All the three statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. See, the International Labour Organization was established back in 1919, even before the UN was created. Because the UN was established after the Second World War in 1945. But the ILO was established after the end of the First World War as a part of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the First World War to an end. The ILO is a very unique organization because it is a tripartite organization that provides for equitable representation to governments, employers, and as well as to the workers. This institution has around 187 member states and it is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. The main mandate of this organization is to promote socio-economic justice in the labor sector by promoting international labor standards. Through these standards, it tries to ensure accessible, productive, and sustainable work around the world in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and more importantly, dignity. These international labor standards have been brought out by the ILO through 189 conventions and treaties, and out of these 189 conventions, 8 of them have been classified as fundamental according to the 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. These 8 fundamental principles and rights that have been recognized by the ILO protects freedom of association, effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, the elimination of forced or compulsory labor, the abolition of child labor, and as well as the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. For its contribution in improving peace and fraternity amongst countries, and for ensuring decent work and justice to workers, the organization was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1969. Key decisions of this organization is made by the governing body, which acts as the executive body of the ILO. It is the governing body which decides upon ILO policies, it decides the agenda of the International Labour Conference, it also adopts the draft programs and the budget of the organization, and it also elects the Director General of ILO. The governing body has equitable representation for several governments, employers, and workers, and amongst them, 10 countries have been provided a permanent seat within the governing body of the ILO by recognizing them as states of chief industrial importance. This includes Brazil, China, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, Russia, UK, and the United States. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, India has been elected as the chair of the International Labour Organization's governing body after a gap of 35 years. Now let's take up the next question. The benchmark interest rate in India is fixed by the Monetary Policy Committee. Option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, the Monetary Policy Committee has expressed concern about the slowdown in the economy as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has also expressed concern about inflationary pressures in the economy. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following are a part of India's foreign exchange reserves? Gold, foreign currency assets, SDRs, or special drawing rights? All the three are correct, so option D is the right answer. See, India's forex reserves that are managed by the RBI includes gold, foreign currency assets such as the US dollar, euro, and other foreign currencies, and SDRs of the IMF, and as well as the reserve tranche of the IMF. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, India's forex reserves has hit a record high of $555.12 billion. Now let's take up a question from the 2018 prelims paper. Consider the following pairs. On one side, we have terms that are seen in news, and on the other side, the context or the topic has been matched. First, we have the Bell 2 experiment matched with artificial intelligence, blockchain technology matched with digital cryptocurrency, CRISPR-Cas9 matched with particle physics. Amongst them, only the second one has been correctly matched, so option B is the right answer. Because Bell 2 experiment is an experiment in particle physics, and CRISPR-Cas9, as we know, is a gene editing technology, whereas blockchain is used for developing digital currencies or cryptocurrencies. So option B is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, discuss the role of FATF in combating money laundering and terror financing with special focus on its review of Pakistan's performance. The second question, states aggrieved by central farm laws are adopting both legislative and legal measures to override them. Critically evaluate its impact. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.